The question of universals is one of the biggest topics in metaphysics, indeed one of the biggest topics in philosophy. Universals are the common principles of which particular things partake. For example, I have here a blue book and a blue stapler, and they both have this quality of blue or of blueness. They share this property in common. That's a universal. Or I have two pens which both have the characteristic or the property or the quality of being greater in length than 4 centimeters. That property of being greater in length than 4 centimeters is shared by them, and it is a universal. Also, they have the property of penness, or the property of being a pen, which is shared by both of them. So universals are these universal principles, or these universal characteristics, or properties, or qualities that two or more particular things share. Now, these two things have something in common. That property of being greater than 4 centimeters in length, and again, that property of penness. These two things have something in common, the property of being blue. And what is that something? Universals theory is the theory that something exists. And according to nearly all accounts, it's a non-physical reality. Here is how the argument for the existence of universals goes. Two or more particular things share certain characteristics. Characteristic of blueness, characteristic of penness, and so on. These shared characteristics accordingly exist because they're there. They have a property in common. Therefore, that property exists. But physical things cannot exist in more than one place. And so it follows that these shared properties are non-physical realities. Now, on Plato's account, they're not just non-physical, they're also transcendent. They exist in a higher reality. Here's the property of penness that they share, but it really is, or what lies behind it really is, something Plato calls the form of penness. Behind this, something Plato calls the form of blue. The form is just the universal principles existing by themselves and independently of the physical things that partake of them. So this is to be contrasted with Aristotle's understanding of universals. On Aristotle's theory, blue exists, but it exists in all these particular things that are blue. Penness exists, but it exists in all of these pens. Property being greater than 2 centimeters in length, 4 centimeters in length, exists, but it does not exist by itself. It exists in all of the things that are greater than 2 centimeters in length. Here's a good book. Here's a good pen. And they share the property of goodness, and that property exists. Goodness exists, and it's a universal thing. It's not a physical thing, and it exists in these things. Thus, says Aristotle. Plato says goodness exists in a higher reality independent of the physical things. Now, there's a very important objection to Plato's theory. And again, it's the theory of forms. He agrees with Aristotle that the universals exist, but he says they exist independently. If universals exist independently, we have a special name for them. The name is forms. The objection to the forms, which actually comes from Plato himself, but Aristotle took it very seriously and rejects Platonism on these grounds, at least this aspect of Platonism. The objection is what we call the third man problem. The problem is this. Here are two pens, and they share the property of penness. Well, Plato explained that by saying that the form of penness explains why these things have penness. Why is the fundamental question, and it's specifically why are these two things both pens? Why do they both have this quality of penness? And Plato says it's because there is the form of penness existing independently of the pens. But the third man problem challenges us to think about this form of penness. Does it also have penness? Is the transcendent pen not a pen? Or is the form of blue not blue? Is the form of being greater than 4 centimeters in length greater than 4 centimeters in length? It seems like it would have to be. And so it seems like that characteristic of that form also needs an explanation. The whole point is to explain the universal shared characteristic of these things. But if the universal itself exists independently of the things, then there is a thing that is penness. The essence of pen exists in a higher reality, and it itself must be a pen. And therefore, it has the quality of being a pen, and that quality of being a pen needs to be explained. And so, behind the first form of penness, we have here these pens, but behind them is another pen, the higher immaterial pen, the form of pen. And behind that form of pen, there must be another form of pen. But it also, of course, will have penness. And so nothing is ultimately explained. Each form has to be explained by that form which comes behind it. This is Aristotle's objection to Plato's form theory, but Aristotle does think the universals exist in a they exist in their non-physical realities, and they exist in the everyday world. They exist in these things themselves. Blue exists in these things themselves. Penness exists not independently of pens, but in all the pens in the world. It's important to note that not everyone who believes in universals thinks that they are non-physical. There's a twist on Aristotelian universals theory given us by the philosopher Armstrong, David Armstrong, in his article Materialism, Naturalism, and First Philosophy. Armstrong suggests that the universals are actually physical things, and he defines physicalism or materialism as the theory that everything that exists is what science can study, specifically physics. And he says that a certain number of universals must exist in order for physics to work. Physics studies universal laws of nature, and those laws themselves must be universals. I don't think Armstrong believes in the existence of penness, but he does think there are some universals. Remember, universals are properties of things that exist in more than one place, which is why most universals theorists think that they're not physical. But Armstrong has defined the physical simply as that which is studied by science. And the universals, he says, at least some of them, the ones that are necessary for the laws of physics to work, are studied by science, and so they're physical things. And it is not a requirement for being a physical thing that a thing not be able to exist in more than one place at the same time. That was, again, David Armstrong's article, Naturalism, Materialism, and First Philosophy, a fine little article in Metaphysics. Now, there's more to say about universals. The alternative to the existence of universals is, well, some other form of materialism. The most popular version among contemporary philosophers, and probably the best version, is what is called trope nominalism. Trope nominalism tells us that the penness of the pens, or the blueness of the blue book and the blue stapler, is not a universal characteristic. There's no blueness that's shared by these two things. Each one has its own blueness. There's the blueness here, and there's the blueness there, and they're individual things. There's no shared property between these two things. And the individual properties, all of these properties are individuals, are called tropes. So when the materialist gives his ontology, if he denies universals, unlike Armstrong, but like most other materialists would do, when the materialist gives his ontology and denies universals, he admits the existence of tropes. But tropes are individual things, not universal things. And they are consistent with materialism. Now, any way of looking at this, the Aristotelian way, Armstrong's way, the Platonic way, or the trope nominalist way, is going to leave something unexplained, or leave something with no external explanation. Something is going to be the unexplained explainer of everything else. Remember, the goal is to explain how is it that these two things resemble each other. How is it that there is a blue property over here and a blue property over here, and that they seem to share something in common. Well, Plato says it's because there's the form of blue, and the form of blue itself seems to be unexplained, except according to the third man problem, it needs an explanation. But maybe Plato will simply respond by saying it does not need an explanation. The form is itself the unexplained explainer of other things. Now, Aristotle will say the universals are the explainers of everything else, and they themselves are not explained, and they're also not so mysterious because they don't need something else behind them, because they're not existing independently. The form of blueness, the universal blueness, not the form, in Aristotle's view, exists in all these blue things, and it does not have its own blueness. It's not blue. Rather, it doesn't have blueness. It simply is the blueness of things. And in trope nominalism, there's a blue trope over here and a blue trope over here, and they don't share anything in common, but they do resemble each other. And that resemblance is simply a fundamental unexplained fact. It's the unexplained fact that explains other facts. And then in Armstrong's theory, the unexplained universals that ground physics, or that ground the phenomena that physics studies, are the unexplained explainers of everything else. Now, I need to make one clarification. When I discuss universals with students and use colors as an example, blue over here, and others will talk about red and so on, there are always a few students who get suspicious and skeptical, and they think blue doesn't exist in these things. Blue is in our minds. It's a mental phenomenon caused by light striking our eyes within a certain range of wavelengths. And I've learned to respond to this by saying it really doesn't matter at all whether blue is the property in the things themselves or what is in our minds. The important thing is that these things share a property. The property is that they tend to reflect light within a certain wavelength that causes us to perceive blue, if you like. If you want to get technical, that's probably the better way of thinking of what blue is. It's not property in the objects, or if it is, it's not the appearance of blue. It's a tendency to reflect light within a certain wavelength. But according to universals theory, these things still have in common that property of tending to reflect light within a certain wavelength. Any property will do that two things share. And the argument for universals begins with this common sense principle that these two things share a property in common, whether it's blueness or tendency to reflect light within a certain wavelength. These two things share in common the property of being greater than 4 centimeters in length and the property of pendness. They share that property in common. That's a common sense principle. And universals theories tend to accept this common sense principle and include universals in our ontologies. And in most cases, Armstrong being an exception, by rejecting materialism. Now, the only other thing I should probably say is that there is a great deal more to say and more to study. And in addition to studying Aristotle and Plato and perhaps reading Armstrong's article, I would suggest you do this. I would suggest you go to this website where the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy has a fine overview of the subject, and study that article. Pause the video if you must, so that you can then copy the URL into your browser if you would like to study this topic further.